Lehman Brothers, it's a sad subject, considering it may be the worst business failure that we'll ever see. Most would agree that it's one of the most significant bankruptcies in US history, and objectively, the biggest. We generally look at them in terms of assets, and at that time, their total assets were valued at $691 billion. I know when numbers get that big, they start to lose meaning. So for a little perspective, here's a graph that shows the top 10 largest bankruptcies of all time. In these terms, massive ones like Enron or GM look like nothing compared to this. In the public's perception, they're probably more associated with the 2008 financial crisis than any other single company. They filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, and look what happened to the stock market right after. That day, the Dow Jones fell 500 points, the biggest drop in 5 years, and things kept getting worse from there. Not to say Lehman Brothers caused this whole crisis, but they were involved in a pretty big way. So here we have this big, significant company, but why? That's a big question. Why were they so important, and what did they even do? Because I feel like this is one of those names that we all know, but few of us can actually answer that question. And by the way, there is no shame in that, because this stuff is complicated. The short answer is that they were an investment bank, the fourth largest one as a matter of fact. And that's an investment bank, as opposed to a retail bank or commercial bank that we all commonly use. The whole concept of investment banking is a little foreign to most people, because the general public typically doesn't encounter them. They exist more for larger companies. But luckily, if you follow this channel, I talk about the stuff that they do all the time. Like, if a company wants to have an initial public offering where they want to sell a portion of the company to the public, well, an investment bank like Lehman Brothers will help make it happen. They're kind of the middle person, connecting the company to the buyers, and they take on the risk because the transaction goes through them. It's called underwriting. Similar with debt financing. If a company wants to take out a loan, they'll call an investment bank and they'll connect them with someone willing to lend them money. Or how about if there's a merger or an acquisition? We see plenty of them on this channel. They'll act as the advisor and be part of the process. Like I said, it gets complex, but I hope that made sense. If not, just think of them as a bank, but for larger companies. They didn't start that way though. They took an interesting path to evolve into it. Lehman Brothers was officially founded in 1850, meaning when they closed in 2008, they were 158 years old. Again, it's sad to see something so old go down like that. They existed through so much and just fell so quick. The name comes from Henry Lehman and his two brothers, Mayer and Emanuel. In the 1840s, Henry immigrated to the United States from Germany, where he went to Alabama and started working essentially as a door-to-door salesman. He did that until he was able to save enough money to open a store. He was better off having people come to him. It was your typical dry goods store for the time, selling clothing and your everyday items. Once he had it up and running for a few years, one at a time, his brothers made the trip from Germany to join the business. By 1850, they were all there. They called the business Lehman Brothers, and that marks the official beginning. Sadly enough, Henry Lehman, the guy who started it all, died 5 years later from yellow fever, and his two brothers were left in control. So that's all pretty unexpected. This massive bank originated as a small store in Alabama by someone who died expecting that that would be the extent of the business. But here's what happened. It was actually cotton, of all things, that fueled the transition. I realize that some of this may sound silly today, but cotton was actually a really big deal back then, especially in the South. See, being located in 1850s Alabama, a good portion of Lehman Brothers customers were cotton farmers. They would walk up to the counter, buy something, and instead of cash, they would pay with cotton. I told you, it sounds silly, but it was in demand enough to function as a form of currency. The Lehman Brothers would then seek out people to buy it from them, and they gained connections that way, and it quickly became their new business. Soon enough, they were just buying cotton from the farmers and selling it to the manufacturers or whoever wanted it. Eventually, they became somewhat of a cotton broker, simply connecting the buyers and the sellers and collecting a fee for doing it. They opened an office in New York, and believe it or not, not were a big part in starting the New York Cotton Exchange. From there, they made the logical move and started expanding into other commodities. You could see the direction they're starting to move here, how they made that jump into finances. It's a good thing that they did too, because by the turn of the century, the cotton business wasn't quite what it used to be, and they felt that it would be a smart move to continue pulling away from it and moving toward the business of underwriting. Remember, that's when they serve as the middle person between the company and the investors when they're looking to sell their stock. They were successful in this because they would seek out smaller, emerging industries that the larger banks deemed to be too risky. One of their first targets in the early 1900s was retail. Again, it's strange today, but it was seen as being risky. Lehman Brothers was able to find some promising companies to do business with, and the risk paid off. During that time, they served as underwriters for Sears, Woolworth, and Macy's. And then over and over again, they would move to a new industry and have the ability to seek out some future successes. After retail, it was movies when they worked with Paramount and Fox, and then it was aviation when they worked with TWA. Later on, it was consumer goods, automakers, technology. We can be here for a while listing off companies that Lehman Brothers helped in these ways. And through all of it, they transformed into a large, reputable investment bank. Skipping ahead a bit, the next big move was in 1984 when they were bought by American Express for $360 million. They spent the next decade as part of their investment banking division until they were spun off into their own publicly traded company in 1994, and they remained independent until the very end in 2008. Alright, that's how they turned into the major bank that they became. Now, onto the bankruptcy. Obviously, for something with this much strength and power, it would take a lot to bring them down. Well, are you familiar with the mortgage crisis that was happening right around that time? I'll give a quick overview. Early in that decade, real estate was the place to make money. There was a dot-com bubble, and for other reasons, the stock market was down, and real estate was a better alternative. There were low interest rates, government incentives to buy it, the demand kept going up along with the prices. So many people saw it as such a solid investment that they were willing to take out loans that realistically they couldn't afford just to become part of it. That's where the subprime mortgages come in. That's when someone doesn't qualify for a traditional loan and they have bad credit or whatever, so they're granted a subprime mortgage at a higher rate. There is a higher risk of them not paying it, but if you're the bank, who cares? Because you could just take that house and sell it to someone else. Everyone was making money this way. I'm telling you, for the years leading up to 2006, real estate was seen as an amazing investment. But then, the interest rates went back up, and the demand went down along with the prices. It turns out those high real estate prices may have been a bit inflated. On top of that, many of those crazy subprime mortgages were set at an adjustable rate, meaning that the rate was now higher and their interest payments were more, while the actual value of the home was less. It kept imploding on itself. This has all been covered many times before, but the important part here is the perceived value of real estate went way down. This was not good for Lehman Brothers because they were heavily involved in real estate on multiple levels. Remember, it was a great way to make money for a while, and that positive reinforcement motivated them to look away from the risk and continually increase their involvement. I mean, that shift into real estate did amazing things for the company. In 2007, they reported record profits, over $4 billion, up from $1 billion only 5 years earlier. That year, their revenue also hit an all-time high, approaching $60 billion. In February of that year, their stock price hit an all-time high at $86. Their market cap was also around $60 billion. By almost any financial measure, this was the peak of Lehman Brothers. Gosh, when the value of that real estate went down, they were affected. Let me show you how involved they actually were. For one, there were mortgage-backed securities. When a retail bank originates a mortgage, it has value because whoever took it out is going to spend the next 15 or 30 years making interest payments. Since it has value, it can be sold. These retail banks sell them to investment banks who then package a bunch of them together, creating a security that can be sold to investors, hopefully at a higher price than they bought it for. I know it's getting tricky again, but essentially, Lehman Brothers was the proud owner of thousands of people's mortgages in the amount of $76 billion. It's a few steps removed at this point, but when people stop paying them and default on their mortgage, that's bad news because it means all these securities that they created lose their value. Also, a few years earlier, they started functioning operating as a retail bank when they got deeply involved into originating the mortgages. In the early 2000s, they acquired 5 companies that did it, including one that specialized in those risky subprime mortgages. At the end of 2007, they held $5.2 billion worth of these subprime mortgages, and let's face it, many of those were not going to be paid. On a third layer, Lehman Brothers was investing in real estate themselves. They held $22 billion worth of it. They were pretty affected by this one. When the real estate market crashed, they lost billions of dollars here. And as if that wasn't enough, I'm gonna add one more layer to everything that compounds it and just makes it even worse. Lehman Brothers went into debt so they can buy all of this nonsense. The idea behind it was that they can borrow money at a low rate and then turn around and invest it at a higher rate, which did not hold up when things went bad. They became more and more leveraged as time went on, which made things unstable. When they filed for bankruptcy, they did have more assets than liabilities. $691 billion compared to $668 billion. So theoretically, if they sold everything they owned, they would be able to pay off their debts. But they couldn't sell everything they owned because so much of it was tied into all these investments that no one wanted to touch. $691 billion in assets, and only $7 billion of it was available in cash. That's pretty bad. This is like when you're playing Monopoly and you put all your money into buying houses, and then when you land on someone, you don't have any cash to pay them. I think it's becoming clear what was happening here, but just to summarize, Lehman Brothers took out a bunch of loans to buy stuff that quickly lost most of its value. They weren't the only ones. Banks all over the place were harmed by it, but Lehman Brothers was the biggest one to fail from it. The others either had a better balance sheet or were more diversified and therefore less exposed. Some of them were bought by a competing bank or saved by a government bailout or a combination of them, but not Lehman Brothers. A week before the bankruptcy, that stock price was down to $7 with a $5 billion market cap. It was looking like the government might step in and help. It didn't happen. It was rumored that Bank of America might buy them. That also didn't happen. They ended up buying Merrill Lynch instead. There were talks of other things happening, but none of it did, and that was it. Competitors bought pieces of it a little later, but September 15, 2008 is when they filed for bankruptcy, and that marked the end of it. It sparked some bad things to happen on the stock market and help expose the public to everything that was happening in the housing market. Sadly, after 158 years of business, that's going to be their legacy. Let me know in the comments, how did I do in explaining all of that? It can definitely get tricky, but I hope I at least was effective in conveying the main ideas here. This was an important company. It's impacted American history, so I think it's valuable to know a little bit about them. So any thoughts related to Lehman Brothers, the housing market, the recession, or any of it, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.